It didn't start as a confrontation. It started as a joke, quick, polished, perfectly timed for late-night television. But within seconds, the laughter shifted. The tone changed. And what was supposed to be another smooth interview turned into something far more revealing. Because sometimes, on live TV, the script slips. And when it does, you see everything. Before we break this down, subscribe to Prime Talk, hit like, and share your thoughts in the comments below, because moments like this aren't just entertainment. They are history happening in real time. It was a night that looked routine on the surface. The set was familiar. The energy was relaxed. The audience was ready to laugh. Jimmy Kimmel, one of late-night television's most seasoned hosts, sat across from Kevin Hart, one of the biggest comedic voices in Hollywood. Two professionals, two entertainers, both known for controlling a room. But this wasn't just another promotional interview. There was context, heavy, recent, unavoidable context. Just weeks before this appearance, Kevin Hart had been at the center of one of the most publicized controversies of his career. He had stepped down from hosting the Oscars after past tweets resurfaced, sparking backlash and a broader cultural conversation about accountability, growth, and forgiveness. The story dominated headlines. It divided audiences. And it placed Hart in a position he rarely found himself in, on the defensive. Meanwhile, Jimmy Kimmel wasn't just any host. He had hosted the Oscars himself. Multiple times. He understood the pressure, the scrutiny, the global stage. And more importantly, he understood the moment Kevin Hart was walking through. So when Hart sat down across from Kimmel, this wasn't just comedian-to-comedian banter. This was something else. At first, everything followed the expected rhythm. Smiles. Applause. Light jokes. The kind of opening that reassures the audience. This is going to be fun, easy, comfortable. Hart leaned into his natural charisma, delivering humor with the precision that made him a global star. Kimmel matched him, as he always does, with a calm, conversational tone. But underneath that surface, there was tension. Not loud, not obvious, but present. Because everyone in that room, and everyone watching at home, knew there was one topic that hadn't been addressed yet. And the longer it went unspoken, the heavier it became. This is what makes live television unpredictable. There's no pause button, no edits, no second takes. When a conversation shifts, it happens in real time. And when it involves a controversy this public, this recent, and this personal, the stakes rise instantly. For Kevin Hart, this appearance wasn't just about promoting a project. It was about navigating a narrative that had already been written about him, one that questioned his past, his response, and his willingness to engage with criticism. For Jimmy Kimmel, the challenge was different. As a host, he had to balance entertainment with responsibility. Avoiding the topic entirely would feel incomplete. Addressing it too aggressively could shift the tone completely. The question wasn't just whether to bring it up. It was how and when. Because timing, on live television, is everything. The audience could feel it. That subtle anticipation that builds when a conversation is circling something bigger. The laughter started to space out. The pauses became slightly longer. The energy, while still controlled, began to shift. And then, it happened. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but deliberately. A question was introduced, not framed as an attack, not delivered with confrontation, but positioned carefully, almost gently. The kind of question that sounds simple on the surface but carries weight beneath it. The kind of question that changes everything. What followed wasn't chaos. It wasn't shouting. It wasn't a viral outburst. It was something quieter. And in many ways, more powerful. Because Kevin Hart didn't deflect the way many expected. He didn't fully retreat. Instead, he responded in a way that revealed something deeper, about his mindset, his frustration, and his perspective on how the situation had been handled publicly. And Jimmy Kimmel, rather than pulling back, leaned in, subtly guiding the conversation forward. This is where the moment transformed. What started as a standard late-night segment became a real-time negotiation between two perspectives. One man defending his growth and decisions, the other carefully challenging him to reflect on them. No script, no edits, just conversation. And in that space, something rare happened. Authentic tension on a platform built for entertainment. For viewers at home, it was gripping. Not because it was explosive, but because it was real. You could see it in Hart's body language. The way his tone shifted slightly. The pauses between his words. the balance between humor and seriousness that he was trying to maintain. You could see it in Kimmel, too. His pacing slowed. His questions became more intentional. His usual comedic rhythm gave way to something more measured. This wasn't about getting laughs anymore. This was about getting answers. And as the exchange unfolded, it became clear this wasn't going to be just another interview clip that fades away after a broadcast. This was a moment people would replay, analyze, debate, because it touched on something bigger than either of them. It touched on how public figures respond when their past collides with the present, how media platforms handle accountability, and how audiences interpret both. But what made this moment unforgettable wasn't just the topic. It was the restraint, the control, the fact that neither man lost composure, yet neither fully backed down. That balance created a kind of tension that's rare on live television. The kind that doesn't need raised voices to feel intense. The kind that builds slowly, word by word, until you realize you're watching something that wasn't planned, and maybe couldn't have been. Because no matter how experienced a host is, and no matter how seasoned a guest is, there's always a point where the conversation becomes unpredictable. This was that point. And it all came down to a single question, delivered at exactly the right moment. What that question was, and how Kevin Hart answered it in front of a live audience, is where everything truly shifted. Because once it was asked, there was no going back. In the weeks leading up to that interview, the conversation around Kevin Hart had already reached a level few entertainers ever experience. It wasn't just media coverage, it was saturation. Every platform, every headline, every late-night monologue seemed to circle back to the same issue. The Oscars. For years, hosting the Academy Awards had been one of the most visible and demanding roles in entertainment. It wasn't just about comedy. It was about navigating a global audience, balancing humor with sensitivity, and carrying the weight of Hollywood's biggest night. When Kevin Hart was announced as the host, it felt like a natural fit. His rise had been steady, undeniable. From stand-up stages to blockbuster films, he had built a reputation as one of the most bankable and energetic performers in the industry. But almost immediately after the announcement, old material resurfaced. Tweets, jokes, statements from years earlier, pulled back into the present and examined under a new lens. The reaction was swift. Critics questioned whether those past comments aligned with the expectations of an Oscars host. Supporters argued that people evolve, that context matters, that growth should be acknowledged. What followed wasn't just criticism. It was a cultural debate, and Kevin Hart found himself at the center of it. At first, his response was firm. He addressed the situation publicly, stating that he had already apologized for those past remarks and had moved forward in his life and career. He emphasized growth, maturity, and the idea that revisiting old mistakes without acknowledging change was unfair. But the pressure didn't fade. Instead, it intensified. The Academy faced scrutiny, questions about responsibility and whether they should stand by their choice. The conversation moved beyond Hart as an individual and became something broader, more complex. Then came the turning point. Kevin Hart stepped down. It wasn't a quiet exit. It was a decision that carried weight, signaling both an acknowledgement of the controversy and a refusal to continue under its shadow. For some, it was the right move. For others, it felt like a loss, an opportunity taken away not just from Hart, but from audiences who had anticipated his hosting. And just like that, the narrative shifted again. Now, the focus wasn't just on the past. It was on the response. Did he handle it the right way? Should he have stayed? Should he have apologized again? Or was stepping down itself a statement? These questions lingered, and they followed him everywhere. Every interview became an extension of the same conversation. Every public appearance carried an unspoken expectation that he would address it again, clarify, or expand on his stance. That's the environment Kevin Hart walked into when he appeared on Jimmy Kimmel's stage. But Jimmy Kimmel wasn't approaching this moment as an outsider. He had his own history with the Oscars. He had stood on that stage, in front of that audience, under that same level of scrutiny. He understood what it meant to be both the face of the show and the subject of public evaluation. And that perspective mattered, because it meant Kimmel wasn't just asking questions as a host. He was engaging as someone who had experienced the role Hart had just stepped away from. That added a layer to the conversation. It wasn't just interviewer and guest. It was peer-to-peer. Leading up to the interview, there was no official indication that the topic would dominate the conversation. Late-night shows often walk a fine line, balancing entertainment with relevance. Sometimes controversies are addressed directly. Other times, they are acknowledged briefly and then set aside. But in this case, ignoring it entirely would have felt incomplete. The audience knew it. The viewers at home knew it. And Kevin Hart knew it. That awareness created a kind of pressure, quiet but constant. It showed up in timing, pacing, and the subtle choices a host makes about when to pivot and when to wait. Jimmy Kimmel is known for that kind of control. His interviews often feel relaxed, but there's a structure beneath them, a deliberate flow guiding the conversation. That's what made this situation different, because the structure had to accommodate something unpredictable. Kevin Hart, for his part, had already addressed the controversy multiple times. He had explained his position. He had defended his growth. And he had made it clear that he didn't want to keep revisiting the same topic. That set the stage for a potential conflict, not of personalities, but of intentions. Would Kimmel push further? Would Hart engage again? Or would both navigate around it? As the interview began, it leaned toward familiarity. Jokes landed. Stories flowed. There was laughter, genuine and expected. For a moment, it felt like the controversy might remain in the background. But that didn't last. Because the longer a topic like that goes unaddressed, the more noticeable its absence becomes. And Kimmel understood that. He didn't rush into it. He let the conversation breathe. He allowed Hart to settle in, reconnect with the audience, and remind everyone why he had become such a dominant figure in comedy. That patience was strategic. Because when the moment finally came, it wouldn't feel abrupt. It would feel inevitable. From Hart's perspective, the challenge was immediate. He had to stay consistent with his previous statements while navigating the possibility that the conversation could shift at any moment. That's not easy on live television. There's no pause. No edits. Every response is immediate, and every word carries weight. And yet, he remained controlled, confident, measured. But even in that control, there were subtle signals, slight pauses, small shifts in tone, moments where the energy changed just enough to suggest awareness of what might be coming. Because experience doesn't remove pressure. It just changes how you carry it. As the interview progressed, the balance between humor and seriousness became more delicate. The jokes were still there, but they began to share space with something else, anticipation. The audience could feel it building. Not because anything had gone wrong, but because something hadn't happened yet. And everyone was waiting for it. That's what made the moment so powerful. It wasn't just about what would be said. It was about when it would be said. Jimmy Kimmel had the platform. Kevin Hart had the story. And between them sat a question that hadn't yet been asked, but was already shaping the conversation. When it finally arrived, it wouldn't need to be loud. It just needed to be precise. Because sometimes, the simplest question carries the most weight. And when that question came, live, unedited, in front of an audience that had been waiting for it from the very beginning, everything changed. The shift didn't come with a warning. There was no dramatic pause, no signal to the audience that the tone was about to change. It happened the way these moments often do on live television, quietly, almost seamlessly, woven into the flow of conversation. Jimmy Kimmel leaned forward slightly, still composed, still calm. Up to that point, he had allowed humor to carry the interview. But now, there was a subtle recalibration. The rhythm slowed. The space between words widened just enough to signal intent. And then he asked it, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but directly. A question about the Oscars, about stepping down, about whether things could have been handled differently. On the surface, it sounded simple. But in that moment, it carried the full weight of everything that had come before. Kevin Hart didn't answer immediately. For a brief second, there was a pause. Not long, but noticeable. His expression remained controlled, but the energy shifted. The quick, effortless rhythm he had maintained earlier slowed just slightly. That pause mattered, because on live television, even silence speaks. Hart leaned back a little, adjusting his posture. His hands, which had been animated during lighter moments, became more still. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but no longer playful. He began by reaffirming what he had already said publicly. That he had addressed those past comments. That he had apologized. That he had grown. His tone was measured, deliberate. There was no attempt to turn the moment into humor. Instead, he chose clarity. Each word felt intentional, as if he understood exactly how much weight the moment carried. Kimmel listened closely. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to respond. He allowed Hart to finish, maintaining eye contact, acknowledging the response without breaking its flow. The audience, usually quick to laugh or react, was quieter now. They were listening too. Hart continued, explaining his frustration, not with intensity, but with control. He made it clear that he felt he had already addressed the situation, already explained his position, and didn't fully understand why it needed to be revisited repeatedly. There was no denial, but there was resistance to repeating the same explanation. And that became the core of his response. Kimmel followed up carefully, not by challenging directly, but by offering perspective. He suggested that in situations like this, a renewed acknowledgement, another statement, can sometimes shift public perception. His tone remained neutral, almost conversational. But the implication was clear. And that's where the tension deepened. Because now the conversation wasn't just about what happened. It was about what should have happened. Hart leaned forward this time, engaging more directly. His tone remained controlled, but there was a noticeable firmness. He didn't dismiss Kimmel, but he didn't agree either. He stood his ground. He reiterated that he had already taken responsibility. That repeating the same apology wouldn't change anything. That growth should be recognized without requiring constant validation. The exchange stayed respectful. That's what made it powerful. There were no raised voices, no interruptions, just a clear difference in perspective, unfolding in real time. Kimmel didn't escalate. He adjusted. He acknowledged Hart's point, then asked another question, slightly softer, more open-ended. It wasn't about challenging anymore. It was about understanding. And Hart responded. He spoke about intention, about context, about how material from years ago can be interpreted differently when brought into the present. He emphasized that his evolution as a person should matter, that it shouldn't be completely overshadowed by past mistakes. His pacing slowed. Each sentence felt deliberate. The audience remained engaged, but quiet. The usual rhythm of laughter had faded, replaced by attention. Kimmel allowed that silence. He didn't rush to bring the conversation back to humor. Instead, he let it stay in that space, somewhere between interview and dialogue. That decision mattered, because it allowed the moment to fully unfold. At one point, there was another pause. This one slightly longer. Hart had finished speaking, and for a brief moment, neither man said anything. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was real. The kind of pause that only happens when both sides are processing what's been said. Then Kimmel responded. Not with a question, but with a statement. He acknowledged the complexity of the situation, that there wasn't a simple answer, that both perspectives carried weight. That shifted the tone again. The tension didn't disappear, but it softened. Hart nodded. A small gesture, but meaningful. Because in that moment, the exchange stopped being about defending a position. It became about being heard. And that's what made it stand out. Not because it was explosive, but because it wasn't. In an environment where controversy often leads to conflict, this remained controlled. Focused. Real. Every word was happening live. No edits. No second takes. Just two individuals navigating a moment in real time. As the conversation began to transition back toward lighter topics, the energy shifted again. Slowly, the rhythm of the show returned. Laughter reappeared. The pacing picked up. But something had changed. Even as the interview moved forward, that exchange lingered. Because it revealed something deeper than a typical late-night segment. It showed how a public figure responds when challenged, not aggressively, but directly. It showed how a host can guide a difficult conversation without losing control of it. And most importantly, it showed what happens when a moment unfolds without a script. By the time the segment ended, the audience applauded. But it wasn't just for the jokes. It was for the moment they had just witnessed. A moment built not on spectacle, but on timing, restraint, and the weight of a single question asked at exactly the right time. The applause came, but it felt different. Not louder, not more energetic, just heavier. There's a subtle shift that happens in a room when something real has just taken place. The audience still claps, the host still smiles, the show continues, but underneath it, there's an awareness that what just happened wasn't part of the usual rhythm. That's what lingered as the interview wrapped. Kevin Hart smiled, nodded, and leaned back into the familiarity of the format as the conversation moved on. The laughter returned in small waves. The pacing picked up again. But the earlier exchange didn't disappear. It stayed just beneath the surface, shaping how everything that followed was received. Jimmy Kimmel handled the transition carefully. He didn't ignore what had just happened, but he didn't dwell on it either. That balance is what defines experienced hosts, the ability to recognize when a moment has reached its natural conclusion. He allowed the show to return to its lighter tone, guiding the audience back without forcing it. But even in that transition, there was a noticeable restraint. The jokes were shorter, the pauses slightly longer, as if both men understood that the atmosphere had shifted, even if only temporarily. For the studio audience, the reaction was immediate but controlled. There were no audible disruptions, no visible discomfort that broke the flow. But the engagement had changed. People were listening differently now, not just for humor, but for meaning. And for viewers watching at home, the impact was even more pronounced. Because live television removes the filter. There are no edits to soften tension, no cuts to reshape pacing. What they saw was exactly what happened: two public figures navigating a complicated issue in real time, without losing composure, but without avoiding the substance either. Within hours, the clip began to circulate. Not as a scandal, not as a meltdown, but as a moment worth revisiting. Because it wasn't about conflict, it was about contrast. One perspective emphasizing growth and closure, the other suggesting that public accountability sometimes requires repetition and reaffirmation. Neither side raised their voice. Neither side fully conceded. And that balance is what gave the moment its staying power. For Kevin Hart, the impact was subtle but significant. He didn't leave the interview as someone who had been exposed or embarrassed. But he also didn't leave untouched. The conversation reinforced a narrative that had already been forming, that his stance, while consistent, would continue to be examined through different lenses. What changed wasn't his position. It was how clearly it had been presented, live, without edits. That matters. Because in a media landscape where statements are often filtered through headlines and sound bites, a live exchange offers something different: context, tone, nuance. And Hart provided all three. He showed control under pressure, consistency in his message, and a willingness to engage, even when the topic was one he had addressed multiple times before. At the same time, the moment also highlighted something about Jimmy Kimmel. His approach wasn't aggressive. It wasn't designed to corner or provoke. Instead, it reflected a different kind of hosting, one that allows difficult questions to exist without turning them into confrontation. That's not always easy, especially on a platform built around entertainment. But it's what gave the exchange credibility, because the question wasn't asked for shock value. It was asked because it needed to be asked. And that distinction shaped how the moment was received. In the days that followed, the conversation continued, not just about what was said, but about how it was said. Media outlets analyzed the exchange, not as a controversy, but as a case study in live television dynamics. How timing influences tone. How delivery shapes perception. How restraint can be more impactful than escalation. Clips were shared, replayed, discussed. Not for outrage, but for insight. And that's what separates moments like this from the countless interviews that fade into the background. They offer something to think about. Beyond the headlines. Beyond the personalities. For Kevin Hart, the long-term impact wasn't about immediate change. It was about reinforcement. The interview became another reference point in the broader conversation surrounding his career at that time. Another moment where he stood by his perspective, clearly and publicly. For Jimmy Kimmel, it reaffirmed his ability to navigate complexity without losing control of the format. To ask the question that matters, without turning the moment into something it didn't need to be. And for audiences, it served as a reminder of what live television can still do. In an era dominated by edited content and controlled messaging, there's something uniquely powerful about a moment that unfolds in real time, where tone can't be adjusted after the fact, where pauses carry meaning, where silence becomes part of the conversation. That's what this was. Not a confrontation in the traditional sense, but an exposure of perspective. A moment where two viewpoints met, neither overpowering the other, but both clearly defined. And that's why it still matters. Because it wasn't about proving someone right or wrong. It was about showing how these conversations actually happen when there's no script, when there's no reset button, when the only option is to respond, honestly, carefully, and in the moment. That's what made it memorable. Not the volume, not the drama, but the control, the restraint, the precision of a single question, and the weight of an answer delivered in front of millions. And if you want more deep dives into moments like this, where live television reveals what edited clips never can, subscribe to Prime Talk, hit like, share your perspective in the comments, And pass this video along to someone who remembers when TV didn't just entertain, it revealed.